So there are two parts to this workshop. The first part, I will focus on how decisions are made at the UN, how this differs from the way the UN is modeled in simulations around the world. And as a part of that, I want to give you some insights into how the UN has evolved since 1945. The UN as an institution has changed enormously. These changes and evolution is not well understood by the general public. And as you can imagine, as the UN has evolved, so too has the way it goes about making its decisions. And that evolution in the decision-making process is equally not well understood by the general public. So we will be going over that as well. So the thing that's unique about the General Assembly, as you know, is that every member state, no matter how powerful militarily, economically, or how small or how poor, every member state has one vote. Every member state is treated equally in the General Assembly. And that's a very important point. I want to look at two articles from the UN Charter that define something very important and fundamental about the General Assembly. In Article 10, it says that the General Assembly, and I'm going to read a little bit further down, may make recommendations to the members of the United Nations or to the Security Council. In Article 14, it states that subject to provisions of Article 12, the General Assembly may recommend measures for the peaceful adjustment of any situation. What is the one thing that jumps out at you that the UN Charter has told us about the General Assembly? Recommendations. And what that means is that any decision that the General Assembly makes is nothing more than a recommendation. That means there's no way to enforce it. There's no way of any country that has agreed to adopt a resolution. They can choose to follow through on it or not choose to follow through on it. There's no way to enforce it. Very different from the Security Council. So the whole notion of consensus, which is one of the basic concepts we'll be exploring today, is one of the means through which the General Assembly does achieve the impact on society that it can't do otherwise because its recommendations, because its resolutions are just recommendations. Were there any other comments on that? Because that was really an interesting point. Yes.
It's going to take the other extreme.
Sure.
The danger nowadays of being a provider, being an outcast, in all areas of society, of life. If you're not one of the groups, you are losing out. So nobody's going to oppose the resolution for fear of being an outcast.
So what you're saying is, that, and this is something people talk about with regard to the General Assembly, is it has a certain moral weight. So that if there is a large majority of member states that support action X, Y, or Z, and other countries don't, that moral weight can sometimes influence the countries to come along, so that happens as well. The work of the GA can be segmented into 5 different parts. The first part is debate. Now we're going to talk a little bit about debate because the way debate is used at the UN is very different from the way debate is used in THIMUN and in other modern UN simulations. It typically is nothing more than making statements or speeches in a formal meeting. The second stage is the stage of negotiation, which is really the heart of how the work gets done at the United Nations. The third stage is taking action. The fourth stage is implementation, and the fifth stage is reporting. We're going to be going through all 5, but the question I want to ask you is which components are typically included in model UN simulations? Anybody else? Yes? 5, okay. Anybody else? So we have 1, 2, and 5. You're in general agreement about that? Okay. Typically, model UN, and I would say even THIMUN as well, 1, 2, and 3, and I'll tell you, we'll go through why. But typically, the first 3 are included in model simulations. The last 2, implementation and reporting, are not included, and I'll tell you why. So the question I'm posing to you is, what impact does the removal of the implementation stage have on the other components of the simulation? What I have found in many Model UN programs is that they will write resolutions and include things in those resolutions that have cost implications which are totally unrealistic. And because they never have to think about, gee, what would it take to actually implement what I'm suggesting, that they just, sometimes it goes far afield. I did find yesterday, actually, very interestingly, in some of the lobbying where they were merging resolutions, some students saying, well, if we do that, they're just going to ask me a question about, how are we going to pay for it? So there is, I don't know how widespread, but I did see some evidence of consciousness here at THIMUN for those kinds of things. But generally in Model UN programs, because implementation is not a part of the process, students generally don't think of that. Yes?
I'm thinking it helps the students be a bit more idealistic in their views. Not so realistic.
Yes.
But looking at the ideal world. But I'm just thinking,
Absolutely.
just doing some further thinking
Yes.
with technology and stuff. It would be nice perhaps if some simulations could be created in the future. So when the resolution is developed, it's put into a simulation, a virtual reality type thing, and we see what happens over a year or something.
Yes.
And then they have to report on what actually happened.
Well, I'll tell you what we are doing in our simulations to help address this issue. But I think that's a very interesting idea. Yes.
As all of us being educators, what do they really learn? In the genuine sense, we certainly go through, our anticipatory sets, and we work with the kids. We do our formative assessments, we do our summative assessments, and at the end of it, what application is involved in that? How did we take them up the hierarchy of learning to the point where they actually are able to articulate back to synthesize and then actually evaluate what they're doing and then create?
Right.
And so we don't get into that creation phase.
Right.
So therefore, what do they genuinely learn, either about the model
Well,
integrations or collaboration and problem solving?
Well, I would say if we do get them to that creation phase, I don't think we get them to that stage where they're able to reflect on what they've created.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the
Yes.
reporting.
Just as a counterpoint, would not the incorporation of cost into Model UN be entirely too problematic?
What I want you to understand, come away with, is how the implementation process is crucial to the negotiation process that goes on at the UN, and without understanding the link between those two, the simulation of UN meetings of what the UN does is off in its own direction. Yes?